and control risk and controls wala stack of chapters. Okay. We'll start with chapter 16. Again, I'm going to make a lot of references to the class that we had in person on Sunday, Saturday, whenever, over the weekend. So the part that we did, which was internal audit, risk management, enterprise risk assessment, etc., is now going to continue into this part of the chapter. The first thing that I want to tell you guys, and we spend some time on this, is who's really responsible for risks in an organization. The buck stops at the board of directors. Okay. Yeah. So when it comes to the hierarchy of everybody in the organization, within the board, there will be a committee which will be the risk and audit committee. If there is not just a risk management committee, which is fairly uncommon, it's usually a risk and audit committee which takes care of everything around risks, audits, internal audits, stat audits, and everything else around the organization around that space. So when you're picking up the risk and audit committee, the responsibility of the board over there is to say what's the level of risk that the organization is willing to take. What is the type of current what is the current level of maturity when it comes to the internal control framework of the organization and everything around it? How are you monitoring risks and reporting risk on a regular basis? Everything around that, something that the risk and the audit committee is responsible for. Okay, guys, it looks like we have a full house. I'd love to see everybody on screen. So as soon as you can, as soon as you practically can, I want you all to be. Now, then that also brings down an important point is the organization's business strategy is also driving some key risks. And the board's responsibility is to identify how do you link and marry the two together, which is the organization strategy, the risks associated, how do you identify them, how do you mitigate them, how do you monitor them, how do you do them. So everything to do with the entire world of risks and audits, the buck stops at the board. Above that is just sharing. Now, on page 479, when you look at that matrix over there or the diagram over there, I'm going to spend some time on that one. The first and most important thing for an organization is its business strategy. The business strategy will result into and give rise to risks within the organization. So the next bit that comes to is what's your appetite for that kind of risk? Are you willing to take it, or are you not going to be able to take it, whichever, or you'll transfer it in all. Now, the appetite of the risk is based on multiple things over here. One, for example, is the sector that you are in. If you are trading in goods, your ability to take risks is up to a certain limit, depending on what's your size, what's your scale, what goods are you trading in, etc. But if you are into the airline industry, your appetite for taking risk is fairly little or low because of the type of industry you're in. Anyone read about some big news around the airline industry yesterday? Talking about
Go first file for bankruptcy.
Voluntarily or forced?
Sorry?
voluntarily or forced to?
No, voluntarily, if I'm not wrong.
I think they were forced to.
I guess because they cancelled the flight operation on third and fourth as well. So it has to be a little planned, right? So forceful रहता तो एकदम sudden shock आता कि मतलब they wouldn't have accepted bookings.
I haven't read the full article yet, but over the next 3-4 days they've cancelled all or most of their flights, and Go First is hope. Not so hopefully, but Go First may file for liquidation proceedings. Sorry, coming exactly to that is based on the type of sector you're into, based on the type of business you're into, based on the size of the organization. If you're a very large organization, if you're a startup group, your ability to take risk will be significantly lower because for you reputation damage is very important, or very you have to be very careful about. Versus the others, if you're a smaller organization, your ability to take risk, your ability to change the product, tailor the product is way faster and way easier because you don't have much to lose. You just have stuff to gain. It also depends on what stage of the product life cycle or the corporate life cycle you are at. If you are in growth stage or introductory stage, your ability to take risk will be higher because you'll want to make changes to your product or service. But as you go towards maturity, your ability to take that risk goes down significantly. Relatable? Then that covers your risk appetite. Now, your risk appetite gets broken down into two parts. The first one is the risk attitude. When you're talking about risk attitude, is what is the organization's ethos or theory or genesis? Are you really an organization where you're conservative or you're fairly aggressive? If you're aggressive, your risk taking appetite will be higher. If you're conservative, you will take lesser level of risk. There are also things to do with how technologically advanced is the organization, how what's the average age of the board or the composition of the board. That also determines what level of risk the organization will end up take. Usually an older board, which is everybody is a 55 plus or a 60 plus, will end up taking lesser risk because of the stage and level of that they are into. And that is exactly why organizations try very hard to be able to have their average age fairly low because people are taking higher risk and more calculated risk for the organization. So
But
that takes care.
so these guys between age 50 plus have the most amount of experience who can actually gauge the risk and handle the risk better.
Which is
Don't you
fair,
think?
and that's exactly why there has to be a fair balance. There has to be somebody who brings in that young uh, thought or the modern thoughts as well on how can you be a little more risk taking, because at the end of the day the more risk you take the more probability of profit, while the people who are 50 plus, their objective would there be okay, accept newer ideas but try and reduce the level of risk and put decent mitigation plan based on their experience over the last X number of years. So it has to be a fair balance between the two. Moving to risk capacity is how much how much risk are you willing to take? If you have to put it in terms of if you had to start a business, what is the level of risk you're willing to take? तुम 1 लाख का risk लोगे कि 10 लाख का लोगे? What's your maximum capacity? Everybody over here will end up taking a different uh, you will have a different risk taking capacity if you had to get into a business of trading, just because of the fact is whether your industry know-how is high or low, the background that everyone comes from, Everything plays a part when it comes to ability to take this or your taking. Now moving to the right side over there, when it comes to risk strategy. Once you've identified you have an appetite, you've identified and listed all your risk down, your risk strategy on whether you should accept some risk, avoid some risk, transfer some risk, or reduce risks comes into play when it comes to risk strategy. We spent some time covering Tara strategy, right? When we were doing the last chapter. So this comes stems from that aspect. And the last one is residual risk. Now, there is never a possibility where risk goes to zero. Never. What you can do is when you identify the risk on the likelihood and impact matrix that we covered. Sorry,
Your video is lagging. Could you repeat what you just said?
I was saying when it comes to residual risk, there is never a possibility where the risks go down to zero, ever. And because of that, because your risk can never go down to zero, you're the only thing you can do is manage the risk. Your likelihood and impact, which is covering the 2 by 2 matrix that we were covering. Whenever you're putting controls into place for the organization, you're only either reducing the impact of the risk or the likelihood of the risk. You're trying to reduce either and or both of them, right? Now, when you've reduced them, that means they'll either go down south or they'll go toward the left. If you can visualize the 2 by 2 matrix, so they'll come and you want to try and get them concentrated as close to the intersection of the x and y axis as much as possible. Now, that part where you can't reduce the impact of risk any further is where you're sitting at is called residual risk. These are risks after you have treated them, tried mitigating them, tried transferring them, and done everything from the strategy perspective. But over there, it's about now trying to accept them, and those are your residual risks of the business. Are we clear here? Fantastic. Can you give it? Can you give the chapter a read up to page 483 of first half? Are we done? Shall we proceed? Okay. Moving on to the next piece, which is the risk and the audit committee and their key responsibilities. Okay. The first thing when it comes to, and if you see on page 483 at the bottom table or the bottom diagram, those are the four key responsibilities of the risk and the audit committee. The first one is to update the company risk profile and the appetite, which is to continuously define and see how much more risk are we willing to take as an organization, how much lesser risk are we willing to take, what are the type of changes that we need to make to be able to ensure that our risk appetite goes up and is well managed, etc. The second one is to be able to raise the risk awareness within the organization, is to tell the organization that, hey, these are the policies that you need to follow, these are the type of things that you need to adhere to from a risk management perspective. This is a culture that we want to build. The third one is establish policies for risk management, which will then define how often, who is responsible for what, how a risk to be identified, how are they to be reported, how are they to be managed, and everything around that. And the last one is to implement processes to monitor and report the risk. These are the key responsibilities of the risk management or the audit company. Guys, if for everybody else in class whom I can't see, can you please put your videos back on? Shall we wait for the others? Harshita, Shank, Vanshita. Now, what is the risk and audit committee really uh, comprise of? It comprises of board of directors, which could be usually a combination of both, which is executive directors and non-executive directors, but both have a very specific role. It is always going to be a majority of non-executive directors because you have to be independent to the rest of the organization to understand the risk appetite, to understand and define risk appetite and things like that. However, there is some executive presence or executive directorship presence that depends is there on the uh, board only because it makes things relatable. कोई आके बोलेगा कि यार this is the risk of the organization and this is the huge risk. The executive team will have the ability to say it is a risk, but these are the three things that the organization is going to be able to manage and control. So there'll have to be a dialogue which is relevant to the organization and to the sector and to the industry. And that's the reason why there is usually executive and non-executive presence, but majority should be non-executive. Now, on page 458, the board usually will have one person who's responsible as the risk manager. Now, whether you call this person head of internal audit, risk and internal audit, you call this person risk manager, whatever the role may be termed as, but there is usually going to be one person whose day-on-day job is to be able to implement the policies that have been identified, continuously monitor risk, report back to the board on how is the risk management of the organization. So all of that usually comes as the responsibility of the risk management. I'm coming to page 468 where I'm talking about risk awareness next. Now, over here, we're covering the element of what types of risks exist and what is the type of awareness that the organization will need to have. Three levels of the organization, which is strategic, tactical, operational. Three levels of risk, which is strategic, tactical, operational. Risks that impact the overall organization's objective and the future of the organization will be strategic risk. taken care of by either the board of directors or the CXOs, etc. And all. Tactical is slightly forward looking over the next couple of months, 3 months, etc. Those are also risks that need to be taken care of by the management layer of the organization. And the last one, which is operational, is usually taken care of by on a day-to-day basis and usually for the nth level of the organization, like people who are on the shop floor, who are taking care of machinery, inventory, finance, etc. All of those. Now, to give you examples of what is a strategic risk, tactical risk, and operational risk. A strategic risk would be, are we, I mean, for example, we pick up both first as an example over here, is 6 months ago or 8 months ago, somebody or the other must have said that, hey, the ability for us to be able to sustain the organization for the next 1 year is dependent on A, B, C, D. Our ability to be able to raise capital or our ability to be able to manage our revenues, cash flows, etc., and all of those types of things. That will be more strategic risk. Things that the board should be responsible for, things that the CXOs will be responsible for. On an operational level, we are doing things like, are we taking care of from um, the rosters that are maintained for uh, you know pilots and flight attendants? Is it as per the compliance that are set out for the by the DGCA? How many hours of flying do they really need to do? Is our system working fine, etc.? Those are my tactical level risks. So operational level risks are things like on the flight, is do we have enough food for all the passengers? Do we have any incidents and events that are happening on flight that are getting reported, not getting reported, and action will take? Those will become everyday routine operational level. Are we clear with this? Fantastic. Now the next question that comes into is what is the source and how do we identify these risks that end up? How do we know that things go wrong, things are being monitored, etc.? One of the key reasons and key things that we need to keep in mind is customer feedback. Is are we collecting customer feedback? Are we acting on customer feedback? And are we ensuring the fact that any sort of request, customization request, etc., that coming from customers is being maintained on a regular day-to-day basis? Then there will always be instances of whistleblower in the organization. So somebody will come back and say, you know what, I've noticed that a particular person is non-compliant to a lot of the processes, etc., activities, policies, and things like that. It is through performance management that things get identified, and through a lot of data analysis and data crunching that you can also identify what are the potential places that things are going. So those are different types of sources from which organizations can identify risks. Give it a read up to page 488. Will be then we proceed further. We done? Shall we proceed? Shall we proceed, guys? Moving on to the next one, which is embedding risks, is the best way to manage risk is to ensure the fact that it exists in day-to-day operations. So you're not saying that, hey, this is a system that takes care of the entire ERP of the organization, which is a financial system. This takes care of the sales piece of the organization. And there's another system which is maintained as a part of risk. So whether it's a technology or whether it's a process, risk has to be inbuilt and weaved into the organization on a regular day-to-day basis. Whenever you're going for a discounting, there has to be a delegation of authority matrix which defines who is allowed to approve up to what level. So that's how risk management is taken care of within the organization. So your control systems or your regular processes maintain all your risks as a part of regular day-to-day activities, and there's no real different system, and the responsibility continues to be managed. Moving to page 490 is where, when you're talking about risk as a culture, is are you embedding the ability for the organization to manage and mitigate the risk on a day-to-day basis? Every industry is different. Again, coming to the airline industry, the pilot's responsibility at every given point in time is to manage risk for them before they take every flight. Even if they've taken a flight from Bombay to Goa and they're flying from Goa to Bombay on the same flight, they will check everything before the flight is taken. Right from throttles working fine, the engines are working fine, radars are reading right. Everything that needs to be done is checked at the end of before every flight. That's the type of culture that they're looking at building in that industry. Now, having said that, if you or if there's somebody else who's running a machine at a plant, every morning that you come to office, you're not going to check whether all of these things are working. But the culture in an airline industry is very, very different, where nothing can go wrong or nothing should go wrong. And they're being able to manage and mitigate every risk that was really possible. It may not necessarily be the same in every industry. Wherever safety is the big hazard, that will be done. So there will be everyday checks that need to be defined, that are defined. Moving on to 491, where we're talking about risk management, the TARA strategy. We spent time to be able to read this up. What's important over here is on 493, when you look at the impact and probability likelihood matrix, is which risks should you avoid, which risks should you accept, which one should you reduce, and which one should you transfer. Where likelihood is high and impact is high, you want to try and avoid that kind of risk as much as possible. Where impact is low, but likelihood is high, you want to reduce it. So you'll put controls in place, you'll put monitoring mechanisms in place to say that how can you reduce that kind of risk. Where impact is high and likelihood is low, you want to transfer that off. I mean, for example, a very simple risk that you really transfer is medical insurance, life insurance, car insurance. You're transferring those risks. Where likelihood is low, every day when Singh Saab drives the car does not mean he hits his car, right? He may end up hitting his car maybe once in 5 years or once in 4 years. The impact of it can be high, and hence you transfer that risk and you take insurance against it. A lot of families against two-wheelers, right? Because we'll say likelihood of a hit, likelihood is high and impact is high. We'll want to avoid the purchasing or dealing with a two-wheeler or buying a two-wheeler at all. So everything is nothing but risk management. So you will be able to see on a day-to-day basis when you are avoiding to get into some situation, it's because it may be a high likelihood or a high impact type of situation. Give this a read from 491 from Tara going up to 493. Good to proceed. Easy peasy till now. जब एग्जाम किट करने आएंगे ना तभी पता चलेगा कि everyone stand up. Everyone stand up. Stretch your hands. Rotate your necks. सारी सारे दुश्मन और भी पान. Hey, Ayushi, what was the homework that was given for today?
So I did come the last lecture.
And you should, and I should help you solve for that because
I saw the recording, but I didn't. I didn't get to know the homework as such.
things up. Did I give any homework?
हाँ सर.
मैंने homework दिया था last time.
हाँ रिपोर्ट पढ़ने बोला था आपने.
पढ़ा आपने?
मैंने एग्जाम रीड कर रहा था. रिपोर्ट मतलब नहीं पढ़ा.
Next part, which is on page 495, okay, which is risk management strategy. There is one which is called ALAP, however you want to pronounce it, but which practically means as low as reasonably practically possible. Okay. Is if there is a risk that needs to be mitigated, you spend, and everything from a control perspective requires money. If there is a saving that a risk which has an impact of 100 rupees per year, there's no point in you spending 10,000 rupees on it to be able to mitigate that risk of 100. So, what is how much risk is really required to be for it to be practically possible and practically uh, sensible for you to be able to spend that kind of money behind managing that kind of risk? An example that they've given over here, and something that I associate very well with because it comes again back to oil rigs and oil and gas as a sector, is if I were to spend £1 million or $1 million to be able to manage the risk of somebody falling down stairs and hurting himself or herself, I may not end up spending £1 million. I may find some other ways to be able to manage that risk. But if I were to spend £1 million to save a gas leak, which could then harm society, the nature around it, put 100 people at risk, I would end up spending it. So the issue over there is not about spending the £1 million, but the issue over there is what's the risk that I'm aiming to mitigate and manage. That's the question that I'm clear. Risk avoidance and risk retention, I'm not spending too much time on. We've already covered that. How do you avoid risk and how do you retain risk, which is a residual risk in your organization? Now coming to the next page, which is 496 and 497, is whenever there is a risk which is impacted by an industry, it's an industry-wide risk. So, for example, if I'm selling woolen clothes, I have a risk of the fact that it's a seasonal business. मेरा समझ में कोई जाके woolen clothes खरीद नहीं रहा है, correct? At least in a country like India, unless somebody is traveling to Greenland or Iceland or Europe or somewhere or the other, then you are buying any sort of then you are buying any of these woolen clothes. But otherwise, woolen clothes are always on sale in the month of April because nobody else is buying them. Now, if that's a risk that I'm managing within my business, what will I do? I will get into another industry which sells a lot in summers and does not sell in winters. For example, I will be an apparel manufacturer that will sell winter wear in winters and summer wear or swimwear in summers because that's what will sell at that point. Or I will sell umbrellas because I know when summer months are coming about, the rainy season just about to settle. So I will diversify my risk and of my fluctuations of my business seasonality with taking care of the industry that I work back in. Is that clear? Now, when it comes to we've covered diversification of businesses, whether it is forward, backward, sideways, horizontal, unrelated. We've covered what all of that means. Now, everything, look at it from a risk mitigation lens. If I have a risk of my vendors not providing things to me of good quality and on time, for example, if I am Maruti and my engine manufacturer, I'm seeing that was giving me some defects in the engines, I would rather manage my risk by either having somebody else do that responsibility, I either transfer that, or I get into that business where I manufacture engines myself, or I put together a very, very strong QC team to ensure the fact that risk gets managed. So that becomes, backward integration. If I have huge amount of protests from my dealerships to say that increase my commission, increase this, give me some benefits, etc. I will then start getting into that dealer network and say that, hey, I have company owned shops as well. So India is a very, very important uh, story for Apple. They realize that franchisee, which is your Maples and Aptronics, is not the only way for us to grow in India. They said we'll open our first flagship store, which opened in Bombay. You have read about this, right? 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. Now, the risk, they manage the risk fairly well. If stockouts are happening anywhere else, wherever in the world, wherever in the country stockouts may happen, it will never ever happen. Whenever products are launching, the products will reach here first, then it will go to the franchise. Right? Some bit of forward integration that you really look at from an Apple strategy standpoint. Then you have your horizontal integration where if you think that competition is getting too strong or is is has a USP which will take time for you to build, you end up buying out competition. Arcelor, sorry, Lakshmi Nivas Mittal bought out Arcelor, so it became Arcelor Mittal. A lot of these type of organizations do mergers and acquisitions to reduce the amount of competition spread out there. Swiggy bought out Dine Out to be able to give competition to Zomato. They realized that Dine Out was getting bigger, Dine Out was getting stronger. It was one, the weak cog in the wheel of services that Swiggy was offering. They bought out Dine Out, or they partnered with Dine Out to say that, you know what, that app reduces to ceases to exist, and now we will be Swiggy Dine Out on Swiggy itself. Make sense? Then comes your unrelated diversification. Like I was telling you, if you create woolen clothes, you get into ice cream manufacturing because ice creams don't sell in winter, they sell in summer. Woolen clothes don't sell in summer, they sell in winter. So you're getting into unrelated activities just to be able to diversify your risk of business continuity and activities. Give this a quick read. Shall we continue? Guys, shall we continue? Are we done? The next piece is trying to tell you that, just giving an example of, you can use risk management across any of the strategy theories or model that we use. Okay? And when you're looking at it from an Ansoff matrix perspective, whether you remember Ansoff matrix, new market, new product, old market, old product, or rather existing market, existing product. Over there, what is the least risky strategy and what is the most risky strategy? The most risky strategy is complete diversification. You go to a new product, you launch a new product in an absolutely new market. You either don't know the product and you don't know the market, but you're launching something new. Most risky strategy. The least risky is existing market, existing product, because you know your product, you're making some small tweaks to it. You know your market, you know what your customers are buying. A new product in the existing market is if you look at those 4 quadrants on page 499. So 1 and 4, easy to identify. New product and existing market is slightly more risky. You know your market, you know your customers, so you're already talking to your customers, you know what they want, you're making changes to it and launching something which is new for them. Versus the third option, where you know your product very well, but every market has the ability to be able to accept and behave differently with the product. So much so that if you create, give you an example of television, with the content that Colors creates associates very, very well with Rajasthan, Gujarat, and parts of Maharashtra, versus content that Star creates associates very well with north of India. So every type of content that you create also appeals to a certain part of the country rather than appealing to everyone in the country. So when you're going with an existing market to a new product, new market with an existing product to a new market space, you will still take some time to understand what the market needs, what are the type of things, what's the kind of feedback that you're getting from customers, and how are you being able to imbibe that as a concept or weave that in your product development strategy. So that's how you'd associate risks with Ansoff's matrix. And like this, pick up any matrix that you would want. Whether you pick up 3 generic strategy, you pick up 5 post model, etc. You'll be able to identify how do you manage risk, where is the risk, what is the root cause of the risk, where is it coming in and stemming in from, and how should you end up managing. On 501, we start moving into the aspect of auditing risks. We covered some bit of this when we met last Sunday, where we go and do risk-based audit. You identify risk, you identify test plans against it, you identify controls, and then you check for control gaps or control failures. Control gaps are places where there's a risk, there's no control, that's a gap. Control failure is where you have a control that has been built in, but when you test the control 10 times, 3 out of 10 times it failed. It did not pass. If you had a control that everything above 30% needed to go to somebody for approval, when you check for a sample of 10, 7 times it went for approval, 3 times it didn't go for approval, and it went ahead without it. Now, why do you really have internal audit? We spent some time on this. There is a statutory requirement for internal audit that exists. It gives somebody a fresh pair of eyes to look at the same. Actually, you know what? When I'm spending time on this, move to page 510, 510, which is the last page of the chapter before we come back. What I wanted to understand over here is every organization has four lines of defense. I touched upon this very briefly on Sunday. There are four lines of defense. The first line of defense is your risk management framework. What is your process? Where are your policies? How do you ensure that risks are being managed? And you're defining a lot of that. That is your first line of defense. सबसे पहले मैं policy define करूंगा before I tell people that यहाँ पर तुम make करो तुम check करो. सबसे पहले policy define where I will tell people that this is how business will happen, should happen. Process defined. That's my first line of defense. My second line of defense is then ensuring the fact that within the organization there is a process that's been built in. There's a maker checker control built in. There are systems that are updated to ensure that you cannot proceed to the next step till you don't complete the previous step and things like that. So that becomes my second line of defense. My third line of defense. Second line of defense is primarily the management layer of the company's organization management, which is ensuring the fact that the processes are followed. That becomes my second line of defense. My third line of defense is internal audit, where I identify these are my key controls, whether it's SOX controls, financial controls, operational controls. I identify my list of controls and a third party or an independent party, whether external to the organization or internal to the organization, is coming and checking whether my first line of defense and my second line of defense is working fine. And my fourth line of defense is my external audit. So that's my four-tier structure of my line of defense. Now, when you've understood this, that there are four lines of defense, and I move back to page 503, you'll understand the importance of audit. One, it's a statutory requirement. A company which is above a certain size has to be audited, has to have an internal audit done, has to have an external audit done. The second one is being the fresh pair of eyes. Now, if I am doing something on a regular day-to-day basis, I may not necessarily have an independent person come and give me an outlook which I don't even think of. For example, when you get up in the morning and you cross the road and you go to college, you do it. It's muscle memory for you. You do it as a routine habit. But when somebody comes and from outside in perspective tells you, hey, instead of you taking this route, if you go by this route, it may be faster. That's what Google Map does, right? It gives you a fresh pair of eyes to validate. Sometimes you know the route that you will take from home to college or home to class, but you still check it on Google Map just to say, yeah, shayad there must be a faster route. There may be a traffic jam. So it's giving you a fresh pair of eyes and validating your own thinking or your own habit and routine. The last one is obviously assessing and monitoring the risks of the organization. So what the businesses are not able to do, the people will end up doing when it comes to from an audit. Stages of an audit, we covered this. The first part is identification of all risks, creating that full risk register, risk library, then moving on to assessing them on what is the impact of it, what is the likelihood of that risk, reviewing controls against each of those. So for which risk do I have controls in place? What's the level of control that I have? And then testing on those controls and reporting those controls to say which all controls are working fine, which all controls are not working. So that becomes my 4-step process on my risk. Are we clear in here? Who has got a very tentative nod? Relatable to most of the things that we covered? Give this a read till here, which is from page 501 to 503 before we proceed further. Are we done? Okay. Now comes to the next piece, which is the reporting on internal controls and risk. We covered some bit of this as well, which is what are the roles and responsibilities of directors and auditors in the entire audit framework? Right? Is you have something called as SOX controls. If we would have read through those chapters over there already, is there's something called IFC, which is your financial controls. Every organization, based on because of in India, because of the new Companies Act, needed to go through the entire piece around IFCs, which is your internal financial control. Every process that had that has critical controls that need to be complied with, which have an impact and bearing on the financials of the organization, or very key operational controls of the organization are listed down and they become IFCs, which is your operation controls and your financial controls. IFCs need to be tested for on a regular basis. The how regular is something that an organization can define along with its auditors and the board of directors and the risk and audit committee on what's the ideal time frame to be able to do that. But IFCs come down to auditors reporting on whether those controls are working fine or not. The auditors report to the board. The board then reports back to the shareholders on what are the type of control gaps, big control gaps that existed, if there were any fraud controls that were identified. Also, the external auditors, which is your stat auditors, depend on the IFCs and the audits done on the IFCs to be able to say whether on their the financial statements are free from any bias or free from any fraud or any issues. That's how important your audit tests around IFCs become when it comes to with that, we come to the last part of the chapter, which is assurance mapping 507. Now, before we start with assurance mapping, and I'll talk you all through it, let me tell you all that assurance mapping is not a very critical activity which most organizations. It used to be, but it isn't anymore. But when you move to page 509, what you will over there be able to see is that across critical functions and processes within the organization, whether it's financial reporting, legal, financial controls, IT, etc., they are identifying what is our first line of defense, our second line of defense, our third line of defense, and fourth line of defense. What are the type of activities that exist across each of those, and how well is the organization equipped? Where are the gaps? Where are they messing up? Where is the scope of improvement across your lines of defense against your functions and processes? Where is the organization? And this red, amber, green methodology, you will not be able to see the colors, but if you can see the different shades of gray, dark, light, lighter, and white, you'll be able to identify that wherever there is, wherever there are gaps, wherever there would have been a red, those are places where more work needs to be done by the organization. That's how you improve your first line of defense and the second line of defense. What the organization has control on is actually the first line of defense and the second line of defense. Third and fourth is primarily an assurance that the first and second is working. If third and fourth identify gaps, what you will try and do is you will try and improve your first line and your second line. You're not working back on the third and fourth. The third and fourth is assurance. That's the part which is important. Does that make sense?
So high assurance indicates that the framework is working properly, right?
So over here, I don't know whether that would have been a green or a red, but high assurance would indicate that, I mean, in my mind, high assurance would indicate that this needs priority. So that would have been a red in my mind. And that's why it's dark in color.
So, no, so I'm not still getting it. So high assurance means that the thing is properly in control.
High assurance means things are working well because I
Yeah.
am assured that this is working fine.
Yeah.
Any questions so far? What are we doing for homework? Are we giving a test again on the weekend? Sorry, when are we meeting next? Are we meeting on a weekend or are we